Estate and letting agencies in the 2030s. Today I'm joined by David Smith, who is considered by many as the go-to person when it comes to law and the estate and letting agency industry. David, where do you see our industries, the estate and letting agency industries, being in the 2030s and beyond? Talk to me.
Well, I'm always going to look at this from a legislative perspective, but pressure is just simply increasing in the PRS. You've got higher standards and greater regulation. That tends to drive landlords towards using letting and estate agents and using professionals. And it's very likely off the back of whatever becomes the new Renters Reform Bill, whatever you want to call it, that there will be more requirements for landlords to prove that their properties are up to a particular standard, which are services that estate agents and letting agents will be able to provide, to maintain those properties at specific standards and to act more promptly with repairs and to manage tenants much more effectively. And I think you'll probably find there'll be an increase in licensing or a landlord register or whatever you want to call it. And those all play into the hands to some extent of more professional agents. At the same time, you're likely to see some form of agent regulation. That again tends to play into the hands of larger agents. Agents will have to regulate up. They will have to improve their quality, which they're going to have to do anyway to manage the new, more complex standard structure. So you've got more professional agents, but then they will carry more cost. There will be more cost in training those agents, and you'll have to pay them more money most likely because they'll be more qualified and they've spent longer becoming qualified. You'll probably have a higher insurance cost for agents and a higher general on cost in terms of running all this stuff. So their cost base will go up, which means, of course, they're going to have to think about charging structures and charging models. And realistically, I think the commission-based charging model is kind of on its last legs in the letting sector, in that it proceeds on the basis of a slight lie, in the sense that to suggest that a letting agent being paid on commission is going to try and get a slightly higher rent is only marginally true, because the difference between £600 and £620 when you actually get through all the commission model and the small commission that the actual end negotiator is on is neither here nor there. They're much more motivated to do a deal than they are to do a deal at a particular sum of money. So landlords, I'm not sure, get terribly great value for money out of those arrangements. And of course, lots of agents and especially online firms are starting to come in with totally different charging models. And eventually, I think that's slowly going to seep through the sector. And of course, the more agents have on cost and the more they have liability, the more they're going to want to have much more fixed relationships with landlords providing services. And so things like let only are likely to be a difficult thing to continue to manage for agents, because they will probably accept more liability. At the moment, let only is a pretty low liability scenario. You simply say, tenant over there, landlord there, go and have a chat. Here's a bit of paper. Make sure you all sign it. Don't bother me again. Oh, well, you can give me the deposit and give me some money for that. But other than that, talk to me in a year's time. That kind of model obviously becomes much more complicated if tenants aren't going to come back and talk to you in a year's time because there's no renewal. And no one wants to keep paying you some commission for something you have no involvement in, and arguably you can't charge anyway. But your liability is higher, and you've got a lot of additional pressure potentially placed on you because of greater regulation. So I do wonder how long those kind of models can last. So, and then all of this, I think, puts smaller agents under a great deal more pressure, because all of those on costs obviously fall harder on smaller firms. And the turnover in the sector also then becomes a significant problem, much more so for smaller firms, but across the board. The sector has to get on top of this turnover of people who come into the sector, stay 6 months to a year, and then leave again. Otherwise, training cost takes you out of proportion.
I mean, I find it fascinating that the average letting agent gets paid 50p an hour more than someone who stacks shelves at a supermarket.
Exactly. So where's your motivation to spend ages doing courses and to take on all this extra pressure, and unless it's to wear a suit and drive a car with some branding on it. That's not a great that's not a great deal of motivation to go through all this extra pressure. So something's got to be done to keep people in the sector, to make it attractive to them, because otherwise you're just expending money on training them for it to walk out the door again. And these are exactly the same problems that law firms face as well. We spend a lot of money on training our staff, and law firms have pretty poor staff turnover in many cases, and that's really bad for us. And it's something that law firms are really trying to get on top of, to try and reduce those problems. So, but all of this puts more pressure on smaller businesses, and so I suspect there'll be a lot fewer estate and letting agents come 2030, and many more of them will be operating under either larger brands or franchise networks or something providing much more backstopping and support.
I mean, I was talking about the fragmented nature of the industry, putting open rent aside. You know, the biggest estate agency, letting agency chain, as 1.3% of the UK market.
Yeah,
I mean that's
quite small.
It is, isn't it?
I mean, it's not a retail kind of number. I mean, the other thing, I think there could be a lot more done actually by much deeper thinking by the agent representation bodies. And I'm not particularly pointing at any one of them. There is, in fact, more than one, although people always tend to think of one or two. But they could do a lot more. And obviously that will require them to charge a lot more, but they could certainly do much more in terms of providing more tools to agents beyond merely tenancy agreements and a couple of bits of paper, to enable agents to have a much more structured and triangulated service offering that went a lot further. If you compare how much RICS does for its members, and I appreciate there is a substantial difference in size and scope compared to what agency bodies do, they're just not in the same ballpark.
That's where regulation could come in and help out if the agents are going to be trained up. The likes of your Property Marks and other organisations could do that, and obviously you have to charge more for that.
Yeah, but you've got to be careful what you wish for. Regulation is a dangerous beast, and it has cost all the way through the system. So, for example, different regulatory models have different costs. If you say agents have got to be regulated and there's going to be a regulator, who is that regulator? And you then have 3 or 4 bodies all competing to say, well, it should be us. But if you become the regulator, then just as the Law Society found with solicitors, what will eventually happen is you will not be able to be both regulator and industry body representative. And if you try to do that, it will go wrong for you, as it did for the Law Society.
You can't be poacher and gamekeeper.
You can't do both. And it went very wrong for the Law Society, and they ended up with the Solicitors Regulation Authority being pulled out. And the most expensive regulatory model possible, because there is now in the legal sector frontline regulators like the Solicitors Regulation Authority, which I have to be a member of and pay money to. I also have to still join the Law Society, although increasingly solicitors saying, well, I don't want to join the Law Society, and how do we just not pay them money, but they're still getting a cut? But if we all walk away from it, it'll collapse, and it's teetering already. And then we're still also paying for a further regulator that sits on top of all of them, the Legal Services Board, which sits on top of all of this stuff and takes a cut of money in order to regulate the frontline regulators. And then off to the side, we're also paying for the Legal Services Ombudsman to provide a complaint source. So because now the first line regulators can do complaints, apparently. So you end up with this really expensive regulatory model where there's jobs for the boys everywhere. And it comes out of solicitors' pockets and goes on to my insurance policy, and also, of course, inevitably goes on to my already, in some people's mind, grossly inflated fees. So the difficulty is that it's all very well to say, well, we want to have regulation, but regulatory models come with cost, and it's a lot of cost, and it's in multiple areas. It's not just the cost of paying the regulator; it's the cost of paying for your ombudsman services. It's the cost of paying for your insurance, which will go up. It's the cost of paying for whatever training and other requirements that regulator requires. And you load a lot of cost into a sector that has historically operated on quite tight margins for a long time. And all of that then has to be paid for by somebody, which means landlords and people selling houses. And then that's got to somehow knock down into house prices and rents and come out of share of all of those. So it's an area in which regulation is an easy thing to say, well, yeah, we should regulate. But really? there are lesser things you could do. You could simply impose, as Labour initially proposed in the leasehold and freehold reform bill, a training obligation, which is quite a low cost in addition to where you are now, but potentially gets you quite a long way.
Interesting times ahead. We'll soon find out
Absolutely.
in the years to come. Thank you for your time today, David.
Pleasure.